May our eyes be open and our ears attuned, so that these words may be spoken and heard in the power of love. Amen. Today we have yet another in a series of significant encounters that are told as the Gospel of John unfolds. And in this series of basically confrontations, Jesus meets and confounds various people. Time after time, Jesus cuts across the grain of accepted religious and social assumptions of his own culture. Time after time, fresh wisdom breaks through. Time after time, the people he engages misunderstand what he's about. And this is just the way John likes to tell the story, but of course there's a message coming through in the way John does that. That it might be clear to some of us, but it's by no means clear to others just how significant Jesus is. That, of course, is a very different way of telling the story than we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it's John's way of telling the story. Then, as now, there are different ways to understand Jesus, different ways to appreciate him, different ways to follow him, different ways to tell the Jesus story, and different ways to live God's truth. 2 Sundays back, we had Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night, seeking wisdom, seeking answers, but walking away more confused than before he came. And last week, we had the delightful story of Jesus at the well, crossing yet more boundaries when he meets a woman from Samaria who's something of an outcast, perhaps. Eventually, this woman, unlike most of the men in the story of John, interesting side point, seems to understand the message of Jesus. She goes back to her village and they all come out to meet Jesus, and she becomes an evangelist. In the Greek Orthodox Church, she's an evangelist and a martyr who's known as Saint Photine because she shares the light, phos, where we get photograph and so on from. Such a story and conversion might be told in the Synoptics, but John doesn't have a lot of room for women disciples trekking through the paths of Palestine. And yet the women were there. And it occurred to me as I was putting my thoughts together for this sermon, I wonder what a conversation would have been like if this lady, let's call her Photine, because we have no idea what her real name was, but it wouldn't have been a Greek name in Samaria. Imagine if Photine had caught up with Mary Magdalene and they had a chat about their encounters with Jesus. Okay? What would they have said to each other? Well, if you remember nothing else from the sermon this morning, take that idea away and think about it during the week. Maybe even sketch out from your imagination onto a piece of paper an imaginary conversation between Mary Magdalene and the Samaritan woman. They each encountered Jesus and he turned their lives upside down. Okay? It's okay to use our imagination. What would they have said to each other? And what might Mary and Photine say to us? That has nothing to do with the sermon, but it's just a little bit of homework you might like to do. What we have in this story is the story of a man born blind, and next week, of course, we'll have the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. Controversy and misunderstanding are in full flight in both these stories, as well as in other chapters from John that we don't have time to read on the 5 Sundays in Lent. What we do pick up pretty clearly in the Gospel of John are the tensions between the followers of Jesus and those who adhered to the traditions of Moses expressed through the synagogue. These tensions are at fever pitch in the Gospel of John, and particularly clear in the passage we've read this morning. Almost in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus has enemies, Jesus has opponents, but everybody in the story is Jewish, except for Pontius Pilate and the woman from southern Lebanon whose daughter needs to be healed. Everybody else in the story is basically Jewish. And the critics of Jesus are Pharisees or Sadducees or Herodians, members of that political party. But in John, all of the opponents of Jesus are simply the Jews. Okay, interesting. Like Jesus is not Jewish, Peter's not Jewish. I mean, what's going on here? Now, of course, he means the Jewish authorities, but he says the Jews. And John creates a tradition of Christian anti-Semitism, which culminates at Dachau and Auschwitz in the horrors of the Holocaust. Like the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, the Gospel of John is written within a framework of fear, of alienation, of conflict, of hatred and division. And we see this very clearly at the end of today's Gospel. His parents answered, "We know this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. We don't know how it is that he sees. Ask him, he's an adult." And John adds, they said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That did in fact happen, but not to about 100 AD. So John is obviously telling the story with a perspective that comes 70 years after the death of Jesus. Okay? And it's a nasty, virulent, hate-filled perspective. So running through this long story is the unspoken question, who's actually blind here? The man born blind or the religious experts? People like me, the ones who were authorities in their field. And we get a similar kind of dynamic, interestingly, in that beautiful story, fascinating story in 1 Samuel 16. And I won't even start to comment on bits and pieces, just to say Samuel needs to learn to see differently. Don't look at how tall the guy is. Don't look at how muscular he is. I'm very relieved to hear that. Okay? God looks on the heart. Don't be impressed by the superficial. Look with spiritual eyes, Sam. So who is it that is unable to see God at work in our midst? And what is the wisdom for everyday life that we might discern and distill from this complex story? I think the first and perhaps most important insight is to embrace the idea that we need to look with fresh eyes. We need to remove the blinkers. We need to change the lenses through which we look at others. And given the tragic history of hatred between Christians and Jews, not to mention Christians and Muslims, we need to look at each other differently for the sake of the world. We need our sight to be healed, even if we weren't born blind. Enough of the convenient circles we draw around ourselves and a small group of people whose company makes us feel comfortable and excludes beyond the pale, to use a suitable Irish expression in the shadow of St. Patrick's Day, excludes the people we don't feel comfortable with. Draw a circle. Now, the Anglican circle has always been deliberately large, but even in our church, there are people who want to make it smaller, tighter, and thicker. That is not the work of Jesus. Jesus hates such circles. He will never stay inside the religious boundaries we create. He erases the circles we draw. He leaps over the walls we erect. Over the past year or so, a couple of years actually, it was slowed down by COVID, I've been coordinating an international project called the Afterlives of Jesus, by which we don't mean afterlives upstairs, but afterlives through time, how the impact of Jesus has had a series of kind of afterlives in different historical events and different religious communities and different cultures. And it's 3 volumes now in the book, The first came out about 6 weeks ago. The second is literally sitting on the table at Christian's house while I check the typeset pages. And the third volume, the typeset pages, will arrive in a couple of weeks. What comes through very clearly in the 30-plus essays in those 3 volumes is when we look at the afterlives of Jesus and how he's influenced and been received and rejected and distorted by various people and communities over the centuries, Jesus does not belong to the church. We've lost the monopoly, the exclusive franchise. In fact, we never had it, of course. Rather, we belong to Jesus. He's not, in the terms of Harry Potter, he's not a house elf doing our bidding. So Jesus does not belong to the church, and he means different things to different people from different faiths. But he also means a great deal to so many people and communities and cultures. One of the many insights I received while working in Grafton was shortly after the terrible events in Christchurch, when Grafton and the cathedral got caught up in responding to those events. I got to meet a local Hindu priest who's actually one of the contributors to volume 2 of that series. And of course, I assumed he came from Woolgoolga, who has blinkers, not me. In fact, when I was trying to get his address so I could go around and have a coffee with him, he said, "Oh, I'm in such and such a street just behind Audi, like 2 blocks away from the cathedral." In my mind, he was far, far away at Woolgoolga, where the Sikhs are, but he's a yoga and a Hindu. Anyway, I got to know Vishal and quickly learned that the school of yoga in which he practices is a school which is focused on the wisdom of Jesus as Hindus. So guess what his chapter in the book is about? More than that, he would come to the cathedral periodically, and on the Feast of the Epiphany, I invited him to come in his yellow robes to do the first reading on the Feast of the Epiphany. They shall come from the east with their camels, and from Seba and Sheba and so on. And he was somebody for whom Jesus matters a great deal. And when at the cathedral, he would always come up for communion, and I would always give it to him. Okay? He's a follower of Jesus. He's just not a Christian. He's a Hindu. We no longer have a monopoly on Jesus, but we are the community that exists to live his wisdom and to share his grace with everyone around us. If only we had the eyes to see. No more hatred of the Jews. No more fear of the Muslims, which in this country at election time we disguise as protecting Western civilization. That's code for get rid of the Muslims, and it's in our society. No more disdain for people with disabilities as somehow they should be blamed for their situation. No more insiders and outsiders. No more them and us. Amen.